what we're seeing is the wheels are in motion of both sides, Constantinople and Moscow, galvanizing their forces and crafting their arguments. A couple of things that I think might be helpful for people to know. First, Constantinople has published quite a few documents on their website. They're also published on the website of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in America that present the case for Constantinople never actually giving away the canonical territory of the Kievan Metropolia to Moscow in 1686. Ukrainian historians have contested this transfer of jurisdiction from Kyiv, or from Constantinople to Moscow for quite some time, for centuries now. And what we find in the Constantinopolitan documents, which includes actual scans of the original handwritten documents, is that for the sake of convenience, they asked the Patriarch of Moscow to ordain the Metropolitan of Kyiv, with the stipulation that the Metropolitan of Kyiv would then commemorate in liturgy the name of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And Constantinople is claiming on the basis of this agreement that this was a simple matter of convenience given the proximity of Moscow to Kyiv, of having them ordain the Metropolitan of Kyiv with no additional jurisdiction, that Moscow violated that agreement over and over again, and that this then is an uncanonical situation to essentially have any church, any Orthodox church in Ukraine under the canonical jurisdiction of Moscow. And there are a couple of hints in Constantinople's argument. One of them is that in 1924, the Orthodox Church in Poland received a Tomos of autocephaly from Constantinople. And the Tomos of autocephaly specifically says that the transfer of jurisdiction from Constantinople to Moscow was uncanonical, that this was not part of the original agreement. And that was one of the foundations of the rationale to grant the Orthodox Church in Poland autocephaly in 1924, keeping in mind that in Poland you have, at that time, numerous Ukrainians, especially in the larger regions of Volyn in West Ukraine. Those parts weren't returned to the Soviet Union until 1945 in the Yalta Agreement, although briefly some of those parts were under Soviet rule from 1939 to 1941. But again, what matters here is that the documents speak. The documents say that this was a matter of ordaining the Metropolitan of Kyiv, not simply transferring all jurisdiction of Kyiv over to Moscow. And so this is the basis of the argument of Constantinople's argument that Ukraine is their canonical territory. Now, Moscow has responded with the publication of documents and statements stating that Constantinople recognized their status as a patriarch of all of the Russias, because part of the documentation says that the Metropolitan of Kyiv, even when he was under Constantinople, was the Metropolitan of Kyiv, of Halych, and of Little Russia. However one likes to parse out or debate that word, it's there in the documentation. So Moscow is arguing that the title of the patriarch is as patriarch not of just Great Russia, but of all the Russias, is an indicator that Kyiv is under the canonical territory of Moscow. And there is also an argument that Constantinople worked very hard to always maintain the unity of all of the original principalities, all of the original city-states of Rus. And the word that's used is that there would be the unity of all of Rus, so that Rus would be united. And this is in the medieval period, going into the late medieval period, into what we might call modernity. The problem with this is that the two arguments don't agree, And it seems that it's a stretch to prefer the Muscovite argument over the Constantinopolitan one. Now, the second part of the problem is, you have the two competing arguments, and Constantinople is determined to move forward. They have claimed Ukraine as their canonical territory. They're not reverting from that claim. They're confident in the documents, having published the original documents and translated them into several languages. Second part is that Moscow is calling for a synaxis of all of the heads of the Orthodox churches together to decide the Ukrainian issue. This was something that Moscow wanted to be a part of the Council of Crete before they withdrew from the Council of Crete in 2016, that from this point forward, autocephaly would be determined by a consensus of all of the heads of the Orthodox churches. And that was in the documentation leading up to Crete, but because they didn't participate in Crete and autocephaly didn't make it onto the agenda of the Council of Crete, that issue was never canonized, if you will, by that particular council. So Moscow is appealing now for the convocation of this all-Orthodox synaxis of primates to discuss the issue, and there's mixed reaction within the Orthodox world on whether or not churches are going to participate. News leaked today that Metropolitan Sawa of Warsaw sent a secret letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople urging him to support the convocation of such a synaxis of primates. There's also evidence that the Synod of the Bulgarian Church met yesterday and that they voted to not endorse. So there is no endorsement of this convocation of a pan-Orthodox synaxis. And it also seems that the Orthodox Church in America, a small body, which was granted autocephaly by Moscow in 1970, has said that they would support a convocation of a pan-Orthodox synaxis. In all likelihood, I don't think that synaxis is going to take place. This is one of the conditions of Moscow. It does seem to indicate that breaking communion is not going to be the next step, that they're going to try a number of things before they arrive at the breaking of communion to sever it. But what I think is worrisome is the publication of excerpts from the transcripts of the conversation that occurred between Patriarch Kirill, Patriarch Bartholemew, and Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev on August 31st. These documents appeared in Greek and they've been translated into Russian and Ukrainian, perhaps into other languages. And the conversation, in the course of the conversation, Patriarch Bartholemew stated very clearly that he has received numerous appeals over the course of many years to grant autocephaly to the Ukrainian church from both representatives of the church. And as we know, the entire episcopate of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine in 1991 and 1992 signed that appeal, even though it appears that 3 of those bishops withdrew their support for the appeal at the very last minute in April of 1992. All of them signed the November 1991 appeal and the April 1992 appeal, which also included a statement to Patriarch Alexei protesting very vehemently Muscovite accusations that they were capitulating to Ukrainian state interference. So Constantinople has held on to those documents, and they're saying that that's one example of numerous appeals, that former President Yanukovych was the only president who didn't appeal, and then if both the president and parliament appeal to the ecumenical patriarchate, that these are the elected representatives of the Ukrainian people, and it is their responsibility to act to heal the schism. So the Patriarch Kirill's response to this was that the Ukrainian government is not legitimate. He said that the Maidan was an attempt, it was a coup to seize power, and that this is an illegitimate government, and that Patriarch of Constantinople should disregard this appeal because it's coming from an illegitimate Ukrainian government. Essentially, he said that the Maidan is an illegitimate event, Maidan of 2013, and that as far as he is concerned, only 8% of the Ukrainian people support autocephaly. And this flies in the face of the facts that have been published sociologically, that a majority of those who responded to these surveys on autocephaly, most of the people, when you look at the statistics, support autocephaly, although there's a large number that honestly have indicated that they don't care one way or another. But this publication of the transcript from that discussion between the patriarchs and with Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, I think showed just how far apart the patriarchs of Moscow and Constantinople are on this issue. And so what you see is, on the one hand, Constantinople is moving forward. News was published today that the exarchs that he sent to Ukraine, Archbishop Daniel and Bishop Hilarion of Edmonton, met with representatives from the Ukrainian government to notify them that they're essentially in the home stretch of finalizing preparations for the granting of autocephaly. So from the standpoint of Constantinople, it's a done deal. From the standpoint of Moscow, they still continue to try to garner support. There was an incident in Odessa just this last week where Patriarch Theodoros of Alexandria celebrated liturgy with Metropolitan Onufri and made several statements saying that if autocephaly is going to be granted, it has to occur with a canonical church led by Metropolitan Onufri, which seemed to be a shift in his previous stance, where he co-signed a document with Metropolitan Sawa of Warsaw indicating that they just hope that this will be a peaceful process, that autocephaly is coming. Now, it's interesting that during that celebration, Patriarch Theodoros awarded Vadim Novinsky with the highest award of the Church of Alexandria, the Order of St. Mark. And this would indicate that Novinsky, who has for a few years now been the primary politician in support of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, a very vocal one, is continuing to use his influence in an international Orthodox arena to try to gain support for the side of the Moscow Patriarchate. So I suspect that this is going to continue to play out, and it certainly has implications for intra-Orthodox relations in North America, because recently the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, on the basis, this was I think on September 24th, in their synodal meeting in London, on the basis of events in Ukraine and of Constantinople's sending of the exarchs to prepare for the issuing of autocephaly, they have ceased concelebrating with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and they withdrew from the Assembly of Orthodox Bishops. And that assembly met in Cleveland during the last 3 days, October 2nd through October 4th. And the absence of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was noteworthy. So, again, I think that this is going to be a long process, and it's going to take a long time for it to play out. But what we're seeing is that the sides, the Constantinople and Moscow, are putting forward their arguments and exercising their influence. It's also worth mentioning that the Patriarch of Constantinople in the last several days has concelebrated liturgy with the Patriarch of Serbia, with the Archbishop of Albania, with the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the Church of Cyprus, which is autocephalous, has also indicated its support for autocephaly in Ukraine. So I think we're going to see this play out for a while. I think that both sides are very determined, and that indicates that a schism could be on the horizon. And if it does happen, one can hope that it will be short-lived. There are two sides to this story. The first side is that we have to understand that the Orthodox churches of the world exist still in the mindset of a recent post-imperial period. Many of the churches had just been released from Ottoman occupation when they became autocephalous. Some churches are still Christian minorities in predominantly Islamic countries or regions. And what we're seeing happening with Moscow and Ukraine, and you could add to that Belarus and all of the republics that were part of the Soviet Union, is they're still trying to figure out how to define who they are in the new configuration of nation states that replaced or that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the church itself still thinks in terms of canonical territory. And these claims to canonical territory, they date from periods of time where one church within an imperial structure essentially gave birth to Christianity through evangelization, through what we would think of as a good thing, through the preaching of the gospel, from people hearing that gospel and receiving baptism and thus forming Christian communities. That's the story of the baptism of Rus. And while that's a good thing, that faith was received from the Greeks in Constantinople. I don't think anyone disputes that. But what I think is significant is that the notion of territory and the notion of ownership from a canonical standpoint seems to be the only criterion by which we are even discussing the issue at all. And it seems to me that the case of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which involves much more than being able to point to historical periods of time in terms of who could lay claim to canonical territory, there are a number of other issues that are really important. And I think that we could point to the 20th century, to the role of the church, and that is a very complicated role, and the loss of so many lives through so many wars and revolutions. This should be a part of the conversation. But the church itself right now just does not have the mechanism to look beyond the question of how to resolve a situation. It only knows how to do it through a canonical analysis. And the situation in the Ukrainian church is going to be resolved canonically. And so for those of us who are concerned about what we might think of as colonization or the rights of people to pray in their own language, or simply to be who you are and have the freedom to be the church in the country and the environment and in conversation and in dialogue with the culture that surrounds you, all of those factors are secondary right now to this question of canonical territory. So what's going to happen, I think, is that I think Constantinople has put forward a very persuasive case. But what really needs to happen, see, because this Tomos is going to be given, and it's not going to stop the claim on the part of the Moscow Patriarchate that Ukraine is their canonical territory. And, echoing behind that claim is this notion of один Rus, that there has to be some manifestation in the 21st century of a unity of the nation states or the city-states of Rus from the medieval period. This is utopia, an idealism, a reconstruction that hangs on the hopes of imperial dreams that is highly unlikely and is not going to happen. So if you put forward that argument that Constantinople was always concerned for the unity of Rus, today that concern would have to take into account the restoration of the city-states of Rus, and I don't think that that's Constantinople's concern. Constantinople's concern is to use their patronage of the Kievan Metropolia, by having been the mother church to that Metropolia, to bring those who are considered to be outside of the church now back into communion with the church. So I don't think that some of these other issues are going to be part of the current discussion. That being said, there is absolutely no doubt that the Tomos is not magic. It's not a panacea. You know, it's a document that basically comes from someone else saying, we verify and we concur that you are a legitimate church and that you are self-functioning, and we want to have a relationship with you. We welcome you into the commonwealth of all of the other Orthodox churches in the world. So the task that stands in front of the church in Ukraine, once they've received the Tomos and are an autocephalous church, is what is their mission? What kind of evangelism are they going to undertake? Ukraine is a religiously pluralistic country. Are they going to dialogue with the other churches and religious organizations in Ukraine? Or are they going to withdraw from dialogue and refuse to dialogue with others? I think that part of what's in the background story here is that there's a tendency towards anti-ecumenism in churches like the Moscow Patriarchate, whereas Constantinople has always been involved in ecumenism, especially in the 20th century, going into the 21st with the annual meetings that occur between the Patriarch and the Pope. So once the Tomos is granted, this is going to be an opportunity for the Orthodox Church in Ukraine to kind of break the shackles of being stuck in neutral in this post-Soviet period, and to no longer be defined by the ideologies of Imperial Russia or of the former Soviet Union, and to instead reclaim for itself those core values of the gospel, the proclamation that Jesus Christ is the Lord, and that as a church it is their mission to go forward and to baptize all nations, and to visit the widows and the orphans, and to take care of them, to heal the sick, to cast out demons, and to be a good citizen, a partner of all of the other entities that share that border within the nation state. So those tasks, the immediate post-Tomos future, if you will, of the church in Ukraine is absolutely crucial. And, yesterday, there was, actually on October 3rd and October 4th, there was a meeting in Kyiv of ecumenical meeting that consisted of a Moscow Patriarchate bishop, a Kievan Patriarch bishop, a Greek Catholic bishop, several representatives from the Polish Church, the Orthodox churches under Moscow. There were lay representatives, and the theme of their discussion, there were representatives from Russia, and the theme of their discussion was reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia and the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. And part of the work of that group was a call for reconciliation, a call to actually commit to dialogue, to meeting with one another, to working together to solve problems, and to do so even when they run into obstacles. Because the problem with dialogue is that in the history of the dialogues that have occurred just among the Orthodox in Ukraine, as soon as they hit an obstacle, they withdraw and the dialogue ends. But constructive dialogue is one that when you have a disagreement, you have a cooling off period and then you return to it. So I think that there is hope that after the Tomos, something very positive might rise from the death that is occurring with the Tomos being granted to the church. And that death is going to be death to the ideologies of Imperial Russia and of the post-Soviet period. And that doesn't mean that, by any means that the church is going to take on a Ukrainian nationalist agenda. If that happens, it's going to be heavily criticized by the other Orthodox churches in the world. Because part of the criticism of this whole enterprise of Patriarch Bartholemew is that this is an impetus to establish a national church. And there's a difference between having an autocephalous church that is the church that is within the borders of a particular nation, a sovereign republic, and having a national church. So I think that there's, despite the fact that this is unfortunately being decided on the battlefield of canons, and I'm sorry for the pun, but it's, you know, with the one N, it is being decided in that particular battlefield arena of canonical territory at this point. But there is hope that there will be some real discussion of how to renew the life of the church and how to bring back Christ into the life of the church and the immediate period following the reception of autocephaly. This is a moment of opportunity. This is exactly what you just said. This is an opportunity to seize the moment, because what we're seeing here is essentially, and we have to keep in mind that churches aren't just bishops or figureheads. When we look at headlines, we tend to say that, oh, well, this patriarch said this or that patriarch said that. But churches are communities of people. And we tend to forget that. You know, if one patriarch says something, then we say, well, that's representative of the whole church. One of the interesting things, and it's not necessarily good news, is that there has been some attrition in the churches in Ukraine and elsewhere in terms of the degree to which people participate in their faith. You know, for a lot of people, faith is still making sure their children are baptized and maybe attending church on Pascha, going to confession once a year, and having your basket blessed. And I think that this is an opportunity to say that the church is really going to be with the people as a community to work these issues out and to seize this moment to confront the challenges of the 21st century. And obviously we know that those challenges are formidable, because what's unique to our time is that change comes upon us very quickly. And our churches are not accustomed to responding to change quickly, because we have mechanisms that were formed in late antiquity and in the medieval period. So this is an opportunity for some updating. I think the key is that the updating has to be done within tradition, because one of the things that the Orthodox churches face is that when change came quickly upon the church in the 1920s with the revolution and the fall of the Tsar and the persecution of the church with the Bolsheviks, is that renovationist churches arose. And even in our Ukrainian history, the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church of 1921 through 1930, that was a very innovationist church. They had married bishops. They really privileged the role of the laity within the church. They adopted reforms and canons that led to a fairly rapid updating of the church. And these were not resilient. The Orthodox Church that will emerge in Ukraine, at least initially, will be a fairly conservative Orthodox Church, but it's one that at least many of its current leaders are saying that they're hungry to address the 21st century, because these are the conditions in which we live. And so this is absolutely a moment that needs to be realized and exploited. And I've been comforted to see some historians, theologians, and bishops publicly state that this is a time for a Eucharistic revival, that this is a time for liturgical renewal, that this is a time for a creative approach to the way that we appropriate tradition. And some of these people are taking the opportunity that's been created by this crisis in Ukraine to come forward and to say that we're going to be here to talk about these issues and to provide space for discussion as we move forward. And that, I think that is a very encouraging note. And I'm certainly excited about it, but of course it's tiring and it's frustrating because it's a large church, and one of the things that you have to do to retain communion and not have dozens of schisms occurring at the same time is to respect people who have differing opinions. And that's been a challenge for Orthodox Christians really for quite some time now, but certainly it is today.